That morning, I sat in a small room with no gavel, no defendant's dock, just folding tables, plastic chairs, and a white sign that read, Medicaid Fair Hearing. Yet it felt every bit as heavy as a courtroom. I am Hannah Collins, and today they were deciding whether my mother, an old woman with trembling hands, living on pension checks and a bit of assistance, owed the state $40,000 in care hours she had never received. Across the table, Kayla, my sister-in-law, sat next to a lawyer, her hands clasped so tightly they'd gone white. On my side, it was just me and the Medicaid file they'd sent over, smelling of paper and worry. The investigator clicked the remote, and the screen on the wall lit up. What appeared wasn't text, but a map with small red dots joined into a streak. "This is Kayla's vehicle travel data for May," she said, voice steady. The hearing officer flipped through a stack of papers, reading slowly. "The record shows you reported being at your mother-in-law's home for 172 hours. During those same hours, GPS places your car out of town, your time clock badge at the salon shows you clocked in, and your cell tower data is more than 10 miles away. Do you want to explain that?" Kayla tried to smile. "Maybe. The system got it wrong." I remembered the dinners with the whispers. "Kayla gave up her whole career to take care of your mom. Stop being so difficult." I used to believe I was just the nagging little sister, jealous of the one who sacrificed. Until the day a letter from Medicaid landed in my mailbox, saying that, unless we proved otherwise, my mother would be billed for nearly $40,000 of in-home care services. Mom looked at me, eyes dimmed by age, and asked softly, "What do we owe, honey?" I couldn't answer. Today, I sat still and let the GPS map, the time clock records, and each postmark speak for me. My sister-in-law took money from my mother by falsifying care hours, and I chose to let Medicaid itself pull the truth into the light. Seen from the street, my life looks very ordinary. A small ranch-style house in an eastern Columbus suburb, a lawn trimmed just right, neighbors walking their dogs, everyone so familiar with each other that just by seeing a silhouette, you know which house has just gotten a delivery. I've lived there with my mother, Marianne, since the day she fell and had to start using a walker. Every morning, the alarm goes off at 6:30. I make coffee, check my mom's blood sugar, then help her stand and take slow, careful steps down the hallway. Every time she wobbles even a little, my hand tightens on the walker's rail as if I could hold up the whole weight of time pressing on her back. After practice, I drive her to physical therapy and wait in the lobby with the Medicaid file and a small notebook crammed with medication times, doctors' names, and the case manager's phone number. When we get home at noon, I make a big pot of chicken noodle soup so she can eat it hot, and in the evening, I open my laptop and do cataloging for the library, a part-time job just enough to cover a portion of the bills. 15 minutes drive away, my brother Ethan and his wife Kayla live in a new townhouse development with a spotless garage and a new car that's always gleaming. Every visit to my mom's house is a chance for them to talk about their upcoming trip to Florida, Kayla's new bag, or the TV they just upgraded. I often joke to myself, same family, two different backdrops. On one side, there are gas bills, prescriptions, and physical therapy copays waiting on the table. On the other, online orders and a sigh of relief that we finally aren't strapped anymore. When the Medicaid waiver came through, everything started with an idea that sounded completely reasonable. I remember the evening Ethan called me out onto the porch, scrolling on his phone as he said, "In Ohio, Medicaid lets you pay family members to take care of the person. Let Kayla be listed as the caregiver, and you just stay mom's good daughter. Don't worry about the paperwork, as long as mom has more help." Hearing, "You just need to keep being the good daughter," I felt myself soften. I thought, That's good. As long as mom has another person caring for her. Who else if not the daughter-in-law? I believed it. Believed there was a system on the side of people like my mother, and believed everyone in the family was on the same side. The day Kayla came over to officially become the paid caregiver, she walked in with a Starbucks cup, smiling brightly, asking to take a few selfies with her mother-in-law on the couch. After the photos, Kayla scrolled her phone, squeezed in a nail appointment, occasionally looking up to say, "Yes, ma'am," whenever my mom asked something. In front of the whole family, she casually bragged, "It's all good, Mom. I already submitted everything to Medicaid. From now on, I'm your official caregiver." Ethan stood beside her, nodding. My wife gave up her hours at the salon to take care of Mom. Hannah, stop always nagging about Kayla being a little late. Hearing that made me feel like I really was petty and nitpicky. I stayed quiet, telling myself that as long as Mom was cared for, it didn't matter whose name was on the paperwork. But that afternoon, after Kayla walked out the door, the tapping of her nails on her phone screen still echoed in my head. I cleaned the kitchen, glanced over at the table, and saw the gas bill, the prescription bill, and the notice for the next round of physical therapy copays. I grabbed my laptop, logged into the bank account, and did the math to see if we'd have enough to cover everything this month. Right then, my phone buzzed. A message in the family group chat. Kayla sent a picture of a new pair of shoes with a joke. "Medicaid pays pretty well. We can finally breathe." I looked at the screen and gave a crooked smile, not sure what reaction emoji would possibly fit. I'm the kind of person who writes everything down. Every pill my mom takes, every physical therapy session, the time Kayla arrives, and the time she leaves. I write it all down. Not to catch anyone out, but because I'm afraid I'll forget something important. In the kitchen cabinet, there's a thick notebook with Mom taped along the spine. Inside are doctor's contact info, the case manager's number, follow-up schedules, even notes on how to use the walker without hurting her back. Kayla is different. She's good at making everything look good on the surface. In front of the neighbors, in front of church friends, she's always the daughter-in-law carrying soup, tucking in a blanket around her mother-in-law, saying all the warm things. When people are watching, Kayla is very kind. When the door closes, she usually shrugs and laughs. Honestly, Hannah's a bit of a control freak. I was only 15 minutes late, and your sister acts like it's the end of the world. I listen and don't argue. Just retreat to the kitchen to make more tea for Mom. Maybe I do control too much. Meal times, sleep times, exercise times, appointments. Maybe I am a little stubborn, a little prickly when I see someone only taking photos and scrolling their phone. But every time Mom grips my hand to stand up, eyes fixed on the floor so she doesn't miss a step, I know why I do it. When Medicaid started sending money for the caregiver, that money didn't come into our house. It went into Ethan and Kayla's account. On paper, everything was very clear. Kayla was the official caregiver, and I was still just the daughter at home with Mom, pushing the walker, making soup, paying the bills. Back then, I still comforted myself. It's okay, as long as Mom is cared for. As long as the system is paying someone so she doesn't become a burden. I didn't know that that very trust would lead to the letter demanding nearly $40,000 from my mother later on, and lead me into that freezing hearing room where the GPS map and each time clock entry would start retelling the story in a completely different way. Red flags don't show up with blaring sirens. They arrive in very small moments that, if you're not paying attention, you'll miss. The first time, it came in the form of an A4 printed sheet left on my mom's dining table. That day, I was clearing dishes, absent-mindedly picked the paper up to move it aside so I could wipe the surface, and my eyes skimmed across the numbers. 8 hours day, 6 days week. The line, timesheet, caregiver hours printed in bold on top. My mother's name, Kayla's name, a list of dates, and a column where hours, 8, 8, 8, 8, repeated like a drumbeat. I froze, the glass in my hand tilting, almost spilling. 8 hours a day? 6 days a week? Most of those hours were when I was at home with Mom, just the two of us. No one else in sight at all. I could hear my heart pounding harder than usual, but my mind started making excuses. Maybe they calculate it differently. Maybe it includes phone calls or just being on call. I folded the paper, put it back exactly where it had been, but it felt like from that moment on, my eyes no longer saw everything the same way. In the days after, the sense of something being off started to thicken. There was a day I needed another pair of hands to help bathe Mom. On the days her knees hurt, she could barely stand. I called Kayla. "Hey, could you come by this afternoon to help me bathe Mom? I'm scared she'll slip." On the other end was loud music, Kayla's voice coming through. "Oh girl, I'm stuck at Easton Mall. I've got a nail appointment. Just do what you can for now. I'll swing by tonight." That day, I wrestled with everything alone in the bathroom, reassuring Mom, holding her steady while trying not to let water splash everywhere. That night, when she was asleep, I opened the kitchen cabinet and pulled out another timesheet Kayla had left for Mom to sign. For that very day, in the caregiving hours box, there was still a neat full 8. I looked at my mother's shaky signature underneath, and my heart slackened like a string pulled too tight. The first envelope from the Ohio Department of Medicaid arrived on a sunny noon. I had just come back from physical therapy when I saw a white envelope with the state logo sitting in the mailbox. I shoved the whole stack of mail into my bag and brought it inside. As soon as I set it down on the table, Kayla walked in with her usual Starbucks cup. The moment she saw the logo, her hand shot out. "Oh, that's probably just a routine notice. Let me check it so you and Mom don't have to stress." She pulled the Medicaid envelope out of the pile, tore at the edge, and slid the paper out. In a split second, my eyes caught the heading: Review of Home and Community-Based Services Utilization. And then the paper disappeared into Kayla's purse. "It's nothing," she said, giving a thin smile. "Just a regular review. They send those all the time." I could have said, "That's my mother's name. I want to read it." But I didn't. I let my sister-in-law read it for us. Later, when everything blew up, that was one of the moments I blamed myself for the most. Neighbors always see the things we inside the house don't want to see. Mrs. Jenkins, who has lived next to my mom since before I was born, pulled me aside one afternoon while I was taking out the trash. "Hannah," she said quietly, "that girl with the light hair who drives the white SUV, lately I've only seen her stop by twice, maybe 10 minutes each time. And your mama needs so much care, doesn't she?" I gave a weak smile and said, "Maybe I was out and you didn't see me there." But inside, I knew she wasn't wrong at all. I'm usually there all day, from checking blood sugar in the morning to helping Mom into bed at night. If anyone shows up, I'd be the first to see. And yet, the timesheets kept calmly listing 8 hours, 6 days a week. Every time I tried to talk about medication schedules, about writing down in and out times clearly, the air in the house seemed to get a little thicker. Once I gently said, "Hey, Medicaid audits pretty often. We should just log the actual hours to be safe. I've got a notebook here. I can write it for us if you want." Kayla put down her phone and looked at me, a flash of annoyance in her eyes. "You act like you're the head nurse or something. Medicaid pays me. I know what I'm doing. You just worry about your own stuff." The phrase, "Medicaid pays me," was like a chalk line drawn through the house. On one side, the one who's recognized. On the other, the little sister doing work with no name. I took a step back and kept quiet, but from then on, every time I heard Kayla brag, We finally aren't struggling thanks to the caregiver money. A small knot tightened inside me. The odd signs lined up one after another. Timesheets always completely filled in. Hours of care when I never saw anyone appear. Calls where I begged for help but got, "I'm busy shopping," or "I'm at the nail salon" in return. A Medicaid envelope vanishing into someone else's bag. A neighbor's comments from her window that did Kayla no favors. But what kept me up at night wasn't just the money. It was the thought. If everything is no big deal, like Kayla says, why did she have to snatch that letter so fast? Why does everything involving Medicaid and my mother's name only ever pass through one pair of hands, while the person who actually counts every pill and every step with the walker is treated like she doesn't matter? Back then, I didn't have GPS maps, I didn't have time clock logs, and there was no hearing officer asking, "Do you want to explain?" All I had was the intuition of a daughter who lives with her mom every day, and my own notebook full of scribbles. I wrote down even the things that seemed trivial. Which days Kayla came, what time she showed up, what mom ate, how she slept. I didn't know yet what I would ever use those notes for. I only knew that at some point I would have to prove that the hours caring for my mother did not fit neatly inside a pretty timesheet. And that day did come, shaped like an official letter from Medicaid, as cold as a debt notice, forcing me to look straight at all the red flags I had been trying so hard to dismiss as just coincidence. Evidence doesn't actually show up like a lightning strike, but as a question that seems harmless at the hospital. That day, I took my mom to Wexner Medical Center for a routine checkup. She sat in the wheelchair, her hand still gripping the strap of her purse as if holding on to a final anchor. In the exam room, the case manager smiled warmly, glanced through the file, and then asked very casually, "So Kayla is still the primary caregiver for Mrs. Marion, right? She's still logging a full 40 hours a week?" I froze, thinking I'd misheard. 40 hours? I thought it was only around 20. She looked up, frowning slightly. "No. In our system, it says 40. That sentence echoed in my head the whole drive home. 40 hours a week is basically a full-time job. I flipped back through each day, each stretch of time in my mind. How many times I sat with Mom on the couch, spooning soup into her mouth, helping her into the bathroom, without seeing anyone else. The gap between the numbers on paper and the reality in our house started widening into a hole. A few weeks later, an envelope from Medicaid showed up again. This time, not regular mail, but certified. The mail carrier asking for a signature. By chance, Kayla wasn't there that day, so I went to the door and signed my own name, the pen dragging across the paper heavier than usual. I brought the letter inside, sat right down at the kitchen table, and didn't wait for anyone to read it for us anymore. The first lines were ice cold. They said the care hours in my mother's program were unusually high compared to what was needed. They requested schedules and care logs, or else there would be a deeper review. There was one sentence I kept reading over and over. If fraud was found, the patient, meaning my mother, could be required to pay back all the money that had been paid out. My hands went ice cold, the paper trembling slightly. My mother, the one who sits counting out every pill dollar, who has no idea what anyone is logging in the system, could become the one in debt, just because someone had gotten carried away filling in hours. This time, I folded the letter and tucked it into my own folder. I whispered in my head, "Enough. I have to look this in the eye." Another puzzle piece came from an unexpected place, a little coffee shop near my house. I met Tia, my close friend, who works as a nurse at a nursing home on the north side of Columbus. We sat and talked about shifts, difficult patients, and then, out of nowhere, Tia asked, "Hey, is your sister-in-law's name Kayla Collins? Light-dyed hair? Always posting Starbucks pics? I nodded, my heart suddenly stalling. Tia took a sip of coffee and said, as if she'd just put something together. I saw that name on our schedule. She just applied to work part-time, and on a lot of days she's clocked in for full shifts. On paper, it looks like she's caring for your mom. But on the paperwork, those same hours she's claiming to be at your house? A question that sounded like a joke turned out to be anything but funny. I asked Tia to spell out the dates and times. She opened the scheduling app and pointed to the blocks of time that lined up with the days I'd seen on the timesheets. Solid eights all the way down. That night, when I got home, I opened my mom's Medicaid folder, spread the letter out on the table, and pulled out my notebook. Each day came back. The hour I took Mom to the doctor, the time I cooked, the hour she napped. I compared them to the times I saw Kayla stop by, fleeting visits, a coffee cup in hand, a few quick photos, and then gone. They did not line up with someone working a full 40 hours. A knot in my chest cinched tight. Sometimes, to protect the person you love, you have to peel blood away from feelings and examine them separately. The first confrontation took place in the kitchen, the warmest place in the house, which that day felt suddenly as cold as a conference room. I laid the Medicaid letter on the table, next to a few of the timesheets Kayla had given Mom to sign. I took a deep breath. Medicaid says you're logging 40 hours a week. I just found out you're also working shifts at the nursing home those same days. So, which hours are you with Mom? Kayla looked up from her phone, something flashing in her eyes before she gave a half smile. Oh, you don't understand the system. They calculate it differently. There are on-call hours and all that. Don't stick your nose into how I take care of Mom. I tried to keep my voice steady. I'm not sticking my nose in. I'm just afraid Mom will be seen as taking money she shouldn't and have to pay it back. I need to understand. Right then, Ethan walked in from the living room, catching just enough to jump in for his wife. You're always suspicious of everything. Kayla's trying to take care of Mom, and all you ever do is judge. The phrase, all you ever do is judge, felt like a small knife. Not deep, but dragging. I looked at my brother, the boy who used to play with me on the front lawn, now standing in front of his wife like a wall. I turned to Mom. She sat in her chair, watching her two children, confusion written all over her face. I swallowed all the but and managed only one sentence. If someday Mom has to pay this back, she won't understand it, but Medicaid will still come after her. I can't pretend I don't see it. Kayla shrugged, picked up the Medicaid letter and flicked it. Let me handle it. Paperwork is my job. I stepped forward and, for the first time, took a piece of paper back from my sister-in-law. No, this has Mom's name on it. I'm keeping a copy. That night, as I settled Mom into bed, she asked quietly, Are you kids fighting because of me again? I held her hand. Because of the money under your name. Not because of you. She sighed. Money exists to take care of people, not to make people afraid of it. Her words made my eyes sting. I realized the fight I was about to step into wasn't just with a sister-in-law, but with an entire family mindset. Whoever sacrifices gets to silently decide everything. From the moment I said no to letting someone else read the letters, to false hour logging, to treating suspicion as ingratitude, every relationship in the house shifted. But sometimes, to preserve a real peace for an elderly person, you have to accept waking up the storm that's been sleeping quietly on the page. The letter that made everything collapse came on a completely ordinary afternoon. I was folding towels in the kitchen when I heard the mail truck stop outside, then 3 knocks on the door. I wiped my hands, ran out to sign for a new certified mail envelope. The Ohio Department of Medicaid logo sat in the upper left corner like a cold eye. I brought it in, sat down at the table, and pulled out a sheet of paper thicker than the last one. The heading hit my eyes: Notice of Suspension of Payment and Review for Potential Overpayment. I read each sentence slowly, feeling the temperature in the room drop. The agency said they were temporarily stopping payment for my mother's in-home care, and that if, after review, they concluded there had been fraud, they could recoup $38,000 already paid. That number felt like a stone dropped straight into my stomach. $38,000. For many people, it might be a loan. For my mother, it was the small, fragile safety money she relied on to feel secure about her treatment. Ethan came home just as I was still holding the letter. He snatched it, his eyes flicking straight to the bottom of the page where the amount was printed in bold. His face flushed, almost instantly. "What did you do?" he growled, the paper shaking in his hand. "You called Medicaid, didn't you? You reported something, right? If Mom loses her benefits, it's on you, Hannah." Caught off guard, I stammered. "I just kept the letter. They said they were going to review because the care hours were too high." Ethan didn't let me finish. "If you hadn't been digging through paperwork, calling everyone under the sun, nobody would be looking this closely. Now great. Mom might be stuck with almost 40 grand of debt because of you." Every word he said slapped at the fragile sense of rightness I had. Kayla was standing at the sink, silent at first. Then she stepped over, took the letter from Ethan's hand, skimmed it, and suddenly burst into tears. "You've hated me from the start," she choked, turning to me. "Now you've ruined my job too. Do you have any idea how scary a Medicaid investigation is? They could put me in jail, Hannah? Is that what you want?" The word jail made my mother jump. She sat in her chair, fingers digging into the armrests, lips trembling. She looked from her son to her daughter-in-law, then to me, her eyes wide as if she'd just been thrown into the middle of a fight where she no longer knew who was who. That night, my mother's blood pressure spiked. She was short of breath, her hands cold, saying her chest felt heavy. I called 911. The ambulance took her to the ER at Mount Carmel, red and blue lights sweeping across the walls of the house. In the emergency room, the doctor said she was severely stressed, her blood pressure elevated from tension. I sat by her bed, holding her hand, my head replaying Ethan's accusations on a loop. If you hadn't dug through the paperwork, everything would have been fine. Part of me started to believe that, even while another part of me was screaming, "Fine how? When money was taken under her name and she could end up the one in debt?" A few days later, another letter came. This time, a notice inviting us to a pre-hearing conference with Medicaid. They explained in the letter that through preliminary review they had evidence that the care hours Kayla reported overlapped with her clock-in times at her job and even with shopping hours at a mall. They listed examples. On day X, from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., Medicaid's system recorded Kayla as providing in-home care to my mother. During that same period, time clock data from a facility on the north side of the city showed her working a full shift there. And loyalty card data from a shopping mall also showed several coffee and lunch purchases. Near the end of the letter was the familiar line: if the family could not refute it, the patient could be required to pay back the entire amount. When I read those lines aloud, the air in the living room thickened. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, eyes turned away. Kayla hugged a pillow. Her face flushed, but this time she didn't cry. She just said, "Those systems aren't reliable. They're misreading it." I asked gently, "Then how do you explain it?" Kayla snapped back, "Are you interrogating me again? You think you're an investigator now?" Ethan exhaled sharply. "Hannah, enough. You're making everything a mess. If you'd just left it alone, they would have done a routine check and moved on. Now look where we are." I turned to my mother, She was silent, staring at the letter on the table as if it were a verdict written in a language she didn't understand. For the first time, I felt completely alone in my own house. I was the only one reading every line carefully, cross-checking every hour, asking every question. And because of that, in everyone's eyes, I was the one dragging trouble into the house. They didn't see the numbers in the letter, didn't hear the doctor talk about what would happen if Mom's benefits were cut. They only saw the surface. Before I started digging around, the money kept coming. No one was knocking on the door. After I started asking questions, the recoupment letter showed up. Mom ended up in the ER, and an appointment with Medicaid was set. At meals, every time I opened my mouth, the room suddenly went quiet. Every time Kayla sighed, someone would look over at me as if to say, "See?" But deep down, beneath the guilt and fear, there was a small part of me that still held firm. The image of my mother holding each bill, asking me, "Can we afford this, honey?" And her words, "Money is meant to take care of people, not to make people afraid of it." I didn't know whether I would win or lose against Medicaid, or whether Kayla would be punished. All I knew was this: if I stayed silent, if I pretended not to see the overlapping hours, the padded timesheets, my mother would become the one whose name was on a debt she never even knew existed. And to me, that was the thing I could not bear. But on the way to that Medicaid pre-hearing conference, sitting behind the wheel, I still had to remind myself over and over, I'm not the one destroying things. I'm protecting my mother. I repeated it until the sentence sounded more like the truth than a pep talk. One evening, sitting in the kitchen with the overpayment letter spread out in front of me, I realized I was standing before two very clear choices: either stay silent and sink together with my sister-in-law, or step over to the other side, the side I used to fear. Calling fraud by its name even when it comes from family. I picked up the letter again, my eyes stopping on the small line at the bottom. "If you suspect fraud, please call." My fingers trembled a little as I dialed, but I still dialed. On the other end was the voice of a woman who introduced herself as Monica Reyes, an investigator. I told the truth from beginning to end. The care hours on paper, the work shifts at the nursing home, the neighbor. The letters snatched out of my hands. I ended with a sentence that sounded more like a confession than an accusation. "I'm just afraid my mother will be treated as someone who took money she shouldn't have, when she doesn't even know how to open an app." Monica was silent for a few seconds, then spoke slowly and clearly. "Hannah, you're not the one under investigation. You're the complainant. If you have anything at all that shows someone else is billing for hours they didn't work, we need it. Our job is to protect the patient first, then the system." For the first time in many weeks, I heard a sentence that didn't start with, "Why did you?" Following Monica's referral, I went to a legal aid office, Ohio Legal Aid. There, I met a lawyer named Joel Parker, thin, wearing glasses, always holding a pen, jotting things down. He listened, opened each envelope, looked over each timesheet, then explained very plainly, "On paper, they have your mother's name as the one benefiting from the care hours payments. If you don't prove your sister-in-law committed fraud, then the system will treat your mother as a jointly responsible party. That means they'll go after your mother first, and only then look for the caregiver." I swallowed and asked, "So will my mother be treated as an accomplice?" He shook his head. "Not if we show them the truth. Your mother didn't know anything. The person actually there was you, and electronic traces are very hard to deny now. The good news is, in this era, every time someone clocks in, buys a margarita, or goes online to book an appointment, they accidentally leave ink marks everywhere. From then on, everything stopped being just my feeling and turned into an actual jigsaw puzzle." Monica worked with Medicaid's technical department to obtain the data from the time clock app the caregiver used to check in, check out at the patient's home. That was the app Kayla pressed every time she claimed she was at my mother's house. But in the app, besides the time, there was also GPS location. Monica sent me printouts for a few sample days. Every time Kayla hit clock in for my mother's address, the dot on the map was somewhere else. The Scioto Riverbank, a parking lot outside a bar, a mall parking lot. See? Monica pointed. These are two different worlds. On paper, she's in your mother's living room. On the map, her phone is halfway across town. At the same time, Tia, my friend at the nursing home, helped confirm Kayla's time clock schedule. On the 12th, 14th, 17th, 19th, she worked full 12-hour shifts. Tia texted, along with screenshots of the schedule. Terrifyingly consistent with the days Kayla reported 8 hours of in-home care on the timesheets. Then, it was the little things' turn to speak. Credit card statements showing Kayla sitting at a bar out of town during the exact hours she was caring for Mom, nail appointment schedules, social media check-ins with the caption, "Finally me time," and a bright margarita. Monica gave a dry laugh as she slashed a red pen across the photocopy. She's running the time clock app for your mother's house on the same phone she uses to tag a friend at Polaris Fashion Place. Technology has no concept of its family, so we let it slide. I felt both hurt and relieved. Turns out my sense that I was too picky before now had numbers and coordinates on its side. We also needed human voices, not just data. I went over to Mrs. Jenkins's house and told her everything. She looked at me for a long time, then nodded. If they need me to sign something, I'll sign. Almost every day I see only you there with your mother. That light-haired girl? At most, once a week, I see her car in front of the house for 10 minutes. Tia agreed to testify, writing a statement saying Kayla worked long shifts at the nursing home on the days that matched the timesheets. Joel gathered everything: the neighbors' words, my friends, the case managers, and organized it into a thick file. On one side, what Kayla told Medicaid, on the other, what her footsteps and her phone's signal had left behind. Preparing for the overpayment hearing was like studying for an exam, except this exam would decide whether my mother would carry the label of cheating the benefit system or not. Joel printed comparison charts. On one side, the care hour tables Kayla reported, on the other, a map with GPS dots, highlighting the overlapping days. He turned them into easy-to-read pages. On this day, she says she was with your mother. Here's when she clocked in for a shift. On this other day, she checked in at a bar. No jargon needed. Anyone who can read can see it. He also added hospital notes proving my mother's mobility was limited, that she couldn't wander somewhere else to meet Kayla, and the doctor's lines stating, "Daughter Hannah is the primary in-home caregiver." One evening, when all the paperwork had been neatly arranged, Joel looked at me across the table. "Hannah, do you understand what you're doing? You're not just protecting your mother from this debt. You are reporting the fraud of someone in your family. It's not going to be easy." I looked at the file in front of me. Things that had once been cuts in my heart now turned into evidence. "I know," I said, my voice still a little shaky. "But if I stay silent, my mom will be the one to pay the price. I can't let that happen." It was the first time in my life I felt I was no longer just the good daughter who keeps quiet so the house stays peaceful, but someone who stepped up to say no to injustice, even when it carried the same last name, Collins, as mine. And strangely, in the middle of that fear and hurt, I also felt something like recovery, like I was finally standing on the right side, the side of the person who needed protection, not the side of silence. From the moment I called the fraud hotline to the day I got the official hearing date, my life switched into sprint mode with no pause button. During the day, I was still the old Hannah, helping my mom get out of bed, checking her blood sugar, taking her to physical therapy, cooking the familiar pot of chicken soup, and then rushing to open my laptop to do extra hours for the library. But in between those moments, another Hannah slowly took shape. Hannah carrying a file folder to meet the lawyer, sitting in a small room at Legal Aid with a table full of printouts, listening to Joel show me how to tell my own story. He said, "When you go into the hearing, what matters isn't speaking loudly, it's speaking clearly. You tell exactly what you saw, no more, no less. Don't let anyone provoke you into a shouting match. Let the paperwork and the maps do their job." I nodded, pen scribbling along the margin, feeling strange as I realized someone was teaching me to use the language of the system as a kind of armor, instead of as a high wall that makes me give up. At night, when my mom was asleep, I opened Zoom to meet Monica. She shared her screen, showed me the maps, the columns of numbers, and explained them in the simplest words possible. "This is the day your sister-in-law claimed she was at your mom's house for 8 hours. She zoomed in on a dot on the map. And this is where her phone actually was. By the river, half a city away." At the hearing, you don't need to know the law by heart. You just need to understand what you're relying on. Hearing Monica talk, I suddenly realized that up until now, I had always thought paperwork and rules were things used to make life harder for weaker people. For the first time, I saw they could stand on my mom's side if someone was willing to read them carefully and piece them together. Between trips back and forth to the hospital, legal aid, and home, I also set aside one evening a week to go to a caregiver support group in Columbus. A small meeting room in a church, chairs set in a circle. Some people talked about sons exploiting their mother's benefits. Others cried when they mentioned siblings who didn't believe them. At first, I just sat and listened, feeling like my story was a quiet copy of theirs. A woman around 50 looked at me and said, "You're not selfish for wanting things to be clear. Fraud from family is still fraud. And if you don't stop it, the one who usually pays the price is the elder." That sentence felt like someone putting a hand on my shoulder, not over-soothing, just keeping me from collapsing. While I was clumsily busy upgrading myself like that, the family started splitting into two streams. Ethan built a higher and higher wall around his wife. Every time I brought up the hearing, he would say, "It's probably just a misunderstanding. The system screws up all the time. You make a big deal, then they start digging." Some of Dad's side of the family, at Sunday dinners after church, whispered to each other just loud enough for me to hear. "Hannah is blowing things out of proportion. Kayla's family, after all. Dragging home business in front of Medicaid sounds really bad." Someone even messaged me privately, "Keep a little face for the family, okay?" Each word was a rope tying me back into the role of the good daughter who keeps quiet so everyone has peace. But every time the rope tightened, I thought of the $38,000 and the image of my mom sitting on the hospital bed, eyes dazed when she heard the words, "Pay it back." In the middle of that headwind, my mom was the only one who gave me something to hold on to. One night, after checking her blood pressure, I sat by her bed and roughly explained that there was going to be a hearing, that they would ask me a lot of questions, and ask her too if she was strong enough. Mom was quiet for a long time, as if weighing every word. Then she took my hand, speaking slowly, slightly short of breath. "I don't remember everything, but I remember who is here with me every night. I remember which hand feeds me soup, which hand walks me to the bathroom. If they won't listen to you, then you show them papers. Don't let me end up with a bad name over something I don't know about." Hearing that, something in my chest unraveled. I was no longer doing this just for abstract principles. I was doing it for that instruction, for the trust of someone who doesn't have much left to hold on to. The day before the hearing, my house felt like a mini version of a war room. The dining table turned into a document printing station. I stayed up late, the printer buzzing as it spat out maps, timesheets, letters. I used a highlighter to mark the important lines, the overlapping dates and hours, the sentences in the Medicaid letters about the patient's responsibility, the sections where the doctors clearly wrote that I was the primary caregiver. Pages filled with yellow, pink, and green slowly stacked into a thick pile. I stuck little post-its on the edge of each stack. GPS, time clock, neighbor's statement, doctor's notes. Each label was like a way of telling myself, I'm not crazy. I'm not making this up. Everything has a spot I can point to. Close to midnight, after I'd cleared some of the papers, I leaned back in my chair, looking around the familiar kitchen and feeling like it was a different place. Tomorrow, I would walk into the hearing room, sit across from Kayla and Ethan, with a few strangers wearing name badges. They would ask, "Why did you call the fraud hotline? Why do you think your sister-in-law committed fraud?" And I knew I couldn't answer with, "I just had a feeling." I would have to speak through the papers on the table, through the neighbor's story, through the shifts Tia had confirmed, through the nights I sat massaging my mom's legs. Thinking of that, I felt scared. But mixed in with the fear was something very new. The sense that I was growing out of the mold of, shut up so the family stays calm. I turned off the kitchen light, stopped by my mom's room, straightened her blanket. In the dark, she asked softly, "Tomorrow is a big day, right?" I whispered, "Yes. Tomorrow, we're not just talking about Medicaid money, Mom. It's the day I have to decide who I let define the word family for me, the ones who talk or the ones who do." Mom didn't answer, just squeezed my hand very lightly. Stepping out into the hallway, I took a deep breath and told myself, tomorrow, no matter what eyes look at me, I will sit up straight, call things by their right names, and let the system, for once, stand on the side of the weakest person in this story, my mom. The meeting room at the Medicaid office in Columbus was smaller than I'd imagined. It was just 4 white walls, a long table, some folding chairs, and an air conditioner humming steadily. But when I pushed my mom's wheelchair in, it felt like walking into a real courtroom. On one side of the table were me, my mom, and Joel. On the other side were Kayla with her own lawyer, Ethan sitting pressed close to his wife. At the head of the table was Mr. Daniels, the person coordinating the hearing, with Monica next to him, a stack of files and a laptop in front of her. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest like a pen tapping on the tabletop. Kayla's lawyer started first, his voice smooth, as if he'd rehearsed it. "My client is a devoted daughter-in-law. She gave up work hours to care for her mother-in-law. If there were any mistakes in the times, it was because she didn't fully understand the timekeeping app. A technical error, not intentional cheating." I looked over and saw Kayla slightly lower her head, playing the victim very convincingly. For a moment, I almost believed I really had blown everything out of proportion. Mr. Daniels turned to me. "Ms. Collins, do you have anything you'd like to say?" My throat was parched, and the first sentence out of my mouth shook a little. "I just don't want my mother to have to pay for care hours she never received." After I said that, I suddenly felt a bit steadier on my feet. This wasn't a fight between me and Kayla, but between the truth and numbers that had been bent. Monica opened the laptop and turned the screen toward everyone. A familiar map appeared on it. My city, with little red dots. "This is the data from the app the caregiver uses to clock in when they arrive at Mrs. Marion's house," she explained. "Each dot is one time Ms. Kayla reported arrived at the home. Then she tapped a few more keys, and the screen layered on new lines of text. Work hours at the nursing facility, credit card statements, timestamps for swiping a card at a bar, at a nail salon, at a supermarket. On the 19 days reported as providing in-home care, Monica said slowly. The system records Ms. Kayla as being at Mrs. Marion's address, but the location data from her own phone shows at those times she was 10 to 20 miles away. If this is just an app error, then it's an error that's very good at picking its moments. Joel added summarized statements from Tia and Mrs. Jenkins to the file. Mr. Bifra Daniels read a few passages aloud. I worked the 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. shift with Kayla on many days. The facilities system requires clocking in at the start of the shift and clocking out at the end. During those same hours, on paper, she is recorded as caring for her mother-in-law at home. Almost every day, I see only Hannah there with Mrs. Marion. She takes her to therapy, carries things, cuts the grass. The light-haired daughter-in-law only drops by briefly once in a while. Hearing other people recount my life, I felt both strange and stung, but also lighter. It turned out what I'd seen didn't exist only in my own head. Then it was Kayla's turn to be questioned. Mr. Daniels looked over his glasses. How could you be in two places at once, Miss Collins? At home caring for your mother-in-law for 8 hours, and at the same time working long shifts or at a shopping mall? Kayla swallowed and answered, I usually run back and forth. Some days I stop by my mother-in-law's first and then go to work. Monica didn't raise her voice. She simply played a video from the nursing facility's entrance camera. Kayla swiping her badge into her shift at 6:55 a.m. The app for clocking in at Mrs. Marion's house shows you pressed check-in at 7:02, Monica said. These two addresses are about a 30-minute drive apart. There is no sign you left the nursing facility within the following hour. The whole room went silent. I could hear my mom let out a very soft sigh beside me. Cornered, Kayla changed tactics and turned on me. Hannah has always hated me. She made all of this up. She gave wrong information to Medicaid to destroy me. I opened my mouth, but Mr. Daniels had already raised his hand to stop me. Ms. Collins, he said, his eyes not leaving the file. This data comes from the phone carriers, the cameras, the credit card records, not from anything Hannah made up. Here we're talking about evidence, not family feelings. Sitting in that little room, surrounded by maps, timelines, and the soft sound of my mother's heart beating under her hospital gown, I understood that this moment of confrontation was something unavoidable. And I also understood, for the first time, that I was no longer the always nagging little sister everyone called me. I was the one standing up in the middle of all those uncomfortable looks to say to the system and to my own family, every hour has to match reality, not just the amount of money flowing into an account. When everyone had finished speaking, the room fell into a very strange kind of silence. No one cried, no one shouted. There was only the low hum of the air conditioner and the rustle of paper under Mr. Daniels's hands. He bent down to reread a few lines, then looked up, his voice even but firm. Based on what has been presented, location maps, time clocks, cameras, testimony, I conclude that the reported care hours did not actually occur. This is not a system error. This is fraud. He paused for a beat, then looked over at my mother in a very human way. The person who directly benefited from that money is Ms. Kayla Collins. Mrs. Marion Collins does not have the ability to understand, manage, or give informed consent to this. Therefore, she will not be responsible for repayment. I heard that last sentence like hearing someone lift a boulder off my chest. My mother, who only knew to put her hand where her children and grandchildren placed the line to sign, was finally separated from that pile of paperwork. The official notice from Ohio Medicaid was read right there in the room. Kayla has to pay back all of the money she improperly received, nearly $40,000, on a payment plan, or it will be deducted gradually from any other disbursements. Monica added, still in her work voice, but I could hear a trace of fatigue. This file will be forwarded to the Office of the Attorney General for consideration of prosecution for Medicaid fraud. Ms. Weish, the Kayla Collins, will also be barred from participating in related programs as a service provider in the future. Those words were not a curse, but a door closing on a path Kayla should never have stepped onto. Joel leaned toward me, speaking softly. We're going to file for a no-contact order as well, in case she comes back to put pressure on your mom or on you. You don't have to go through another round of violence, whether it's with words or with tears. I nodded, for the first time seeing the words protection and lawyer standing next to each other in my life without feeling strange. The reaction in the family was nothing as formal as the lines in the decision. Ethan stared at his wife's face, as if he were truly seeing her for the first time. Kayla, did you really do that? He said, his voice no longer angry but a kind of stunned. Kayla burst into tears, the tears rolling down too fast, the words tumbling out after them. I didn't mean to. It's just, we were so tight on money. I thought it was only a few hours, who would know? I'm tired too. I sacrifice too, it's not like I don't. She stood up, the chair scraping harshly on the floor, and rushed out of the room before anyone could say anything else. The door closed, leaving behind a faint scent of perfume and a huge empty space between the people still sitting there. I looked at my brother, wanting to say something, but I couldn't find words light enough not to hurt him, nor heavy enough to erase everything that had just happened. My mother sat in her wheelchair, gripping the armrest as if holding on to the rest of her life, her eyes fixed on the floor. In my head, the question I had always been afraid to face rang out. Is this moment going to tear the family apart? Then another answer, slow and clear, appeared on its own. A family built on stealing care money from an old, sick woman, treating her weakness as a chance to pad more billable hours, had already been cracked for a long time. Today's hearing did not shatter my family. It only turned on the lights so we could see the fractures everyone had been pretending not to notice. And amid all those broken pieces, at least one thing had been kept intact. My mother was placed outside the circle of guilt, and I, even if I was called the troublemaker, had chosen the right side by standing next to her. After the hearing, life did not change color immediately, but little by little, everything shifted. Kayla received the repayment decision, was crossed off the caregiver list. The evenings when the two of them used to post photos of sacrifice for family turned into silence, then arguments. Ethan started going to therapy, for the first time daring to say that he found it easier to close his eyes and believe just to get it over with than to face the truth. I am not happy that someone was punished, but I also no longer have to carry the guilt in place of someone who chose the shortcut. My mother was moved to another support package, with a caregiver from an official agency, with clear supervision. And beside all of those people, there is still me, the daughter who changes bandages, cooks soup, fastens the seatbelt every time I take my mother to an appointment. In Columbus, life gradually returned to a normal but quieter rhythm. I kept working at the library, and in the evenings joined a small group that speaks out about injustices in welfare programs, telling my own story so that others will not be taken advantage of the way my mother almost was. One afternoon, I pushed my mother's wheelchair along the Scioto Mile. The two of us sat eating ice cream watching the water flow. My mother said softly, "Good thing you didn't give up." I smiled, feeling my heart soften. Before, I used to think revenge was bad-mouthing my sister-in-law online, was throwing back a few bitter lines. Now I understand that the most beautiful revenge is being able to protect the person you love, and to let the very system they tried to game turn around and hold justice for them. Looking back, I see clearly. Family is not the people who use my mother's name to pull every dollar out of Medicaid. Family is the people who sit with her filling out forms, calling the hotline, photocopying records, following the truth all the way until it is printed in black and white. If you have ever seen anyone falsify care hours to take welfare money, or simply, if you want to protect people like my mother, please comment the word Ohio so I know you are still here. Hit like so this story can go a little farther, and subscribe to the Revenge Family channel to hear more journeys where the law and the truth, not excuses, always have the final word.